Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals, or Fundamental Principles of a Metaphysics of Morals. Kant is a giant of a philosopher, the most significant philosopher in the modern era. This is one of the great works of moral philosophy. I cannot summarize it in this video or give a proper commentary on the text. I will give you instead a few pointers on the text, things to keep in mind while studying it. First pointer, it helps to know something about the way moral philosophers study what is right and what is wrong. Generalizing a bit, they tend to emphasize one thing as a way of understanding what is right and what is wrong, but they also tend to be aiming at another thing. So Aristotle, for example, in the virtue ethics tradition of moral philosophy, tends to emphasize character. What he aims at is the proper functioning of the human person. John Stuart Mill, in the utilitarian tradition or the consequentialist tradition in moral thought, tends to emphasize the results of our actions, but he aims at happiness. Now, what Kant is doing is a bit different. Kant is in a different moral tradition from those other guys. He is in what we call the deontological tradition. And what Kant does is he emphasizes motives, or the purposes of our actions, the reasons we do the things we do. He emphasizes these things, but what he aims at is the obedience of moral law, the satisfaction of the requirements of moral law. And there's your first pointer. For a second pointer, let's talk about moral law. Moral law, first of all, is universal. It has no exceptions, at least according to Kant. Now, moral law has authority. Moral law is binding on us. If we violate moral law, we are sinning. Moral law is not just good advice or something helpful to do if you want to be happy. Aristotle gives us good advice that is useful for helping us be happy. And Kant, by the way, explicitly tells us that that's just fine. He has no objections to that sort of ethical study that Aristotle does. But he thinks moral law is more important. And what he wants to do is study moral law. And what Kant does, hang on, we'll do that in the next pointer. He's studying moral law, which is more than just good advice or advice for how to be happy. Moral law has authority, and if you violate moral law, well, you're sinning. And speaking of sinning, when I explain moral law in Kant to my students, I inevitably use the language of the Torah, the language of the Bible. When Moses says, or when God says through Moses, "You shall not commit murder," that's the language of moral law. That's the language of a moral principle that has authority over our behavior, that we must obey, to disobey which is to sin. Thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do that. That is the language of moral law. And moral law like that is what Kant is interested in. Third pointer. Kant is interested in a metaphysics of morality. Now, one thing this means is he's interested in understanding what sort of a universe we are living in that has moral law operative in it. He thinks these moral laws do exist. They do obligate us. They are binding on us. They do command us to live in certain ways. And he wants to know what sort of a universe we must be living in and what sort of beings we must be in order for these things to be there, for these moral laws to be in place. He looks at that a bit in the third and final part of the book. But he's also interested in something else. He's interested in what is more literally a metaphysics of morals, a metaphysics of moral law, an account of the structure and nature of moral law itself. And that's your third pointer. Fourth pointer, let's talk about the structure and nature of moral law itself. You can give a formula for moral law, or at least Kant thinks so. Moral law is universal. And since it's universal, you can give this formula for it. I should always act in such a way that the principles on which I am acting are universalizable. That is to say, I can wish that everyone else would act on the same principles. So, Well, let's review that. Let's say that again. Moral law is universal. It has no exceptions. And accordingly, a formula for moral law, the structure of moral law, is when I am acting morally, I am acting I'm acting with motives and reasons that can be universalized such that everyone could act according to them and there would be no exceptions and it would work out right. It's best to illustrate at this point, as Kant does illustrate when he makes these points. So one of the illustrations he looks at is the person who wants to neglect the duty to philanthropy, or the duty to charity, or the duty to almsgiving. Someone who says, I will not harm anyone, but I'm not going to help anyone either, and I don't ask anyone to help me. Now, Kant says, incidentally, that if we all lived this way, it would be a better world, but this would not satisfy the requirements of moral law. Imagine if you lived this way, never harming anyone, and never wanting to help anyone. Kant says, sooner or later, you would want someone else's help. Even if everyone else lived this way, some tragedy probably would eventually befall you. You would get hit by a car. You would find you have cancer. Some natural disaster would occur, and you would lose everything. Your house would be destroyed in a fire or something. Some tragedy would occur, and you would need help from others, and you would want it. And Kant says the selfish person who says, I don't want to help anyone, it's enough if I'm not harming them. Kant says the selfish person who says that really wants other people to help him when he is in trouble. And so this person is not acting according to motives that can be universalized. He himself is incapable of universalizing them because he wants help from others when he is in dire circumstances. So this fourth pointer, I think I'm on the fourth pointer now. Fourth pointer on Kant's moral philosophy is, in studying the metaphysics of morals, he thinks you can give a formula for moral law which will guide our formula for the structure of moral law, which is practical and will guide our decisions. Always act according to principles that are universalizable. And we do act according to principles. When I consider whether to tell a lie for selfish reasons, I am acting according to principles. The principle that I should tell a lie for selfish reasons. But that's not a universalizable principle. So I'm giving you another example here. Also an example from Kant. I tell a lie for selfish reasons. My principle is I should be able to do that. But if everyone did that, if everyone acted according to that principle, no one would believe anything anyone said. And so lies would be useless. And so you cannot universalize this principle. Now, fifth point, and I'll try to make this the final point. The nature of moral law as universal requires that you treat everyone else the way you want to be treated. The nature of moral law requires that since you want everyone to treat you well, you must also do the same for them. Nature of moral law requires that you who consider yourself to be an end in yourself must treat others the same way. Let's pause to note that this is how we humans generally think. We consider ourselves ends in ourselves. We think that we are purposes that obligate others, that others ought to treat us rightly. I'll borrow from the opening pages of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis the sort of illustration that helps to make Kant's point here. If you say that you do not consider yourself to be an end in yourself, a purpose, a being that others ought to treat well, consider how you feel or how you act or possibly how you talk when you are wronged. If I were to walk up to you and hit you on the head with this teacup, you would be angry at me. You would feel that your rights had been violated, that I had violated a moral law and mistreated you, that I had done something wrong. You would think that, you would feel that, you would say that. At least if you're a normal person, you would think or feel or say that, or all three. So you want yourself to be treated as an end in yourself. You want to be treated well. Well, moral law says these principles by which you act, by which you arrange your life, are universalizable. And so here is another practical formula for guiding our lives and for capturing in a practical, handy rule the requirements of moral law. Always treat human beings as ends in themselves. All human beings, and not just yourself. Let me pause to avoid one misunderstanding about this fifth and final pointer on the metaphysics of morals. Incidentally, this and the former rule, which I gave, Kant refers to as the categorical imperative. Don't misunderstand this second formulation of the categorical imperative. He's not saying you must never treat human beings as a means to an end. If you did that, you would starve to death. Kant doesn't want you to starve to death. You must use other people for your own purposes. You must use the person who is selling you food at the grocery store for the purpose of you buying food from the grocery store. Otherwise, you would not be able to buy food and you would starve to death. So you must treat people as a means to an end. Kant is not saying that. He says you must not treat people merely as a means to an end. All human beings, he says, are ends in themselves. And that is the requirement. The requirement of moral law is that you recognize that and live accordingly.